Luke chapter number 15, a story we're all familiar with. And I've read this story and heard this story preached on over and over and over. But this past week, what I heard completely changed this story to me. I want to start off with just a few verses I'm going to read, and you'll see the context as we go. But in Hebrews chapter number 12, verse number 2, I want to read that scripture first. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2 says, "Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame." Remember that word shame. Isaiah said that all we like sheep have gone astray, and we've turned everyone into his own way, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. We've all gone astray. We've all become the prodigal, you might say. Now, Jesus told this story to scribes and Pharisees. You're all right. You're fine. So Jesus is talking to, in this setting, I am not even going to try to compete. I'm just going to wait. You're all right. Jesus is talking to the scribes and Pharisees in this story. But we got to realize, first of all, that Jesus is talking to people who lived in the Middle East, and he's talking to people who lived around 2,000 years ago. One of the problems with translation is not necessarily being able to translate the word as the word is defined in the language. The complication that comes in translation is being able to translate the thought behind the word. You see, we live in a culture that is very different than a lot of other cultures around the world. I don't know how many of you have had interaction with people from different countries, but there is a language barrier that goes beyond just the meaning of the word. There is a thought process. There is a being able to relate to life experience. It's very different across cultures. And so it's no different struggle that the translators of the Bible have when they're trying to translate the Bible from Greek or Hebrew into English. They still have that same struggle. Yes, we can define the word. Yes, we can translate the word into an English that means it basically the same thing. But translating the thought process and the meaning behind the word is very difficult to people who don't understand the context within which those words were spoken. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to try my very best to paint the picture of the context of what Jesus was saying. What Jesus was saying to those people 2,000 years ago is the same thing the Bible is saying to us today. The meaning has not changed. What has changed is our concept or our understanding of what he was saying. And so I'm going to try very hard. There was a man by the name of Kenneth E. Bailey. He died several years ago, but he spent decades in the Middle East studying the cultures, current and ancient, and comparing it to the Scripture. He spent a lot of time writing on the parables of Jesus in the context of the culture and explaining it. That is the source of the information I'm going to share with you today. But there was another pastor that brought that out to me, and I'm just going to try my best to explain what I've learned. And I think it's really going to change how we think about this story. So we're going to just define the setting first of all. First of all, Jesus is talking to the scribes and Pharisees. Now, he's already been in Luke. If you turn back a few pages, you'll see parable after parable after parable where he's already been trying to tell these stories to try to get across a meaning. And the scribes and the Pharisees cannot stand Jesus. They hate him. They are the religious leaders of the time. They are the ones who write the laws of the land. Have you noticed that when you have a group of people whose their only job is to write laws, that you come up with some silly laws? Well, there's no different in that time. And we'll get into some of that. But these scribes and Pharisees did not like the stories that Jesus was telling. It went against what they thought God was. And so they were looking for ways to discredit Jesus because Jesus was having a big impact on the people in the area. And so one of the things that they used was this. You see, the scribes and Pharisees were very, they held themselves apart, trying to live a life of holiness. And so they were very careful about everything they touched. They were careful about how they lived their life. They followed all these very, very strict rules, and they would not even interact with what they considered sinful people because they was afraid it would some way taint them. So they stayed away from the people that society deemed as sinful, your prostitutes, your tax collectors, all these people who were considered sinful of the sinfulest, right? And Jesus, if you remember, he oftentimes hung around these people. And that blew the minds of the Pharisees and the scribes. They're like, how can this man say he is of God and hang around with these kind of people? And so they used that as evidence that they accused him back in Luke chapter 5, I think it is, that when he'd done all these wonderful works, they accused him of doing it by the power of Satan. And they used his interaction with these sinful people as evidence that he was of Satan because he hung around with Satan's people. So in Luke chapter 15, in the very first verse, it says, "Now all the tax collectors and the sinners were coming near him to listen to him. And both the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling." And now remember, we just talked about these scribes and Pharisees. They're the people who wrote the rules. These were the people who had the most influence over the society they lived in. They had the most political clout. They were the ones who told people what they ought to think about stuff, basically. Kind of like what we have today, the news media and politicians. So these people, they had a huge influence on what people thought. And they were grumbling, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." And so he told this parable. And he goes on to explain what the mind of God is. And so he tells a story about a shepherd who has 100 sheep. And he's, at the end of the day, he's counting them all, and he comes up one short. And so he leaves the 99 to go find the one that is lost. And down in verse number 7, it says, Jesus says, "I tell you, in the same way there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance." He's trying to paint a picture here to these guys, these scribes and these Pharisees, that you're not the guys that I came for because you don't think you need me. You're already righteous. You're self-righteous. I'm looking for the one who needs me. They don't get that. But notice that it says there will be joy in heaven over one sinner who repents. That's what brings God joy. God receives joy and glory in the repentance of sinners. That's what Jesus Christ came to do, was to save the lost. That was God's will, God's purpose. That's what brings joy to heaven. Again, Jesus tells another story about a woman who lost a coin. And she looks and looks and finds it, and she calls all her friends for a celebration because she found this lost coin. And then in verse 10 it says, in the same way I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Now, let's get into our third parable, the one we're going to focus on this morning. It says, and he said, a man had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate that falls to me. Now, first of all, let's stop right here. What this young man just done in this culture was one of the most disrespectful, dishonorable things that a man could do. You see, this culture is built upon honoring the father. And in this culture, the father was the provider for the family. He built and built and built, and then he would leave his children a legacy. And in the culture, if a man did not leave a good inheritance to his children, he was considered a failure. But in this, when he did die and the inheritance was received, it was divided unequally among the sons. The oldest son would get the biggest share. And according to Deuteronomy, chapter number 21, verse 17, the older son would get 2/3. The younger son would get 1/3. But they didn't receive their inheritance until after the father was dead. Now, there were instances where the father could give the inheritance early if he chose to and wanted to. If he had trust in his sons and he wanted to be able to help them in learning how to manage that, he may give the inheritance early, but he would still retain sovereign ownership of it, as far as he still had the last word, the last say. He still had the right to any money that came out of that. He was still over it, but he would allow his sons to begin their individual work. I think that's a good idea. This is not what was going on here. What was going on here was this young man was wanting his inheritance right now. He wanted control of it right now. He basically was saying, Dad, I wish you were dead. You're in my way. I want what is mine, and I want it now. Now, there's another thing here. He says, Father, give me the share of the estate. Now, this is an unusual word in the Greek. Not unusual, but different than what we're thinking. He wasn't asking for his inheritance. You see, when the father would give that inheritance, not only did the son receive the property, he also received with it the responsibility to take care of the property and to provide for his family and to build on that. That was part of the inheritance. The young man was not asking for that. That word for that type of inheritance is the Greek word kleronomia. That is the full inheritance. What this young man asked for, the word that Jesus used, was the word tes osios, which is simply, I want the money. I want the property. I want I don't want anything to do with any responsibility. I don't want any. I don't want anything to have to do with this family. I'm done with the whole family, the whole thing. All I want is what is mine to take. I'm leaving this family. Very, very, very dishonorable. Very, very. Let's keep reading and see what happens. So at this point, the scribes and Pharisees, by the way, they went, oh. I mean, this kind of request in that culture would have been met by the dad slapping the boy across the face because he had just dishonored him so badly. Okay? So this is an outrageous request. And then he says, so the father, he divided his wealth between them. The father gave it. He said, okay, you can have it. I'll do it. Very unusual. What this father just done was he allowed the dishonoring of himself by his son. He just gave the son what he wanted. In Romans chapter number 1, we have another illustration of that. Sorry. Down in verse number, let's start in verse number 24. Therefore God gave them over in their lusts of their heart to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. For this reason God gave them over to dishonorable passions. And it goes on to say how bad they went. This is the character of God. God allows a sinner to be a sinner as long as they want to be a sinner. That is what this father is doing in this picture. The father is not demanding his honor. He could. He could have slapped the young man across the face. He could have kicked him out of the family with no inheritance. He could have done any of that. But he didn't. He said, okay, I'll give you what you want. And so he does. And he divided his wealth between them. I want us to notice something here. This young man did not have a good relationship with his father at all, did he? This young man had no respect for his father. This young man had no love for his father. This young man chafed under the rules of his father. He didn't like living in this family. He didn't like living in this house. He wanted nothing to do with this father. Can we relate to that today? Can we see people today who have no desire whatsoever to have any kind of relationship with God? They want what they want, and they want it now. They got their own desires, their own pursuits, their own goals, their own dreams, their own desires. They want to chase what they want in life. They got one life to live. They're going to live it to the fullest, and they have no consideration for the Father. They have no consideration for God. Do we see that today? Can any of us identify with that? I know I can. So he gave it to him. And then in verse 13, and not many days later, the young son gathered everything together. That simply means he turned it into cash. Again, cultural thing. So the young man now has at his disposal all of his property inheritance. He has 1/3 of the land. He has 1/3 of the buildings. He has 1/3 of the stock. He has his inheritance. Now, as I was explaining earlier, in this culture, even though the father had given this to the young man, he had no claim to it. He couldn't take ownership of it until after the father died. But somehow or another, he turns this all into cash. So what does he do? Well, there was an exception in the law that a person could sell it to someone, but they couldn't take possession of it until the father died. You say, well, why would anybody buy that? People do it all day, every day today. It's called futures. You buy today planning on the value being more in the future. Well, that's what he done. He found these people who were willing to invest into this property, and they bought it. Now think about this. What kind of seller do you want when you're going to buy something expensive? You want a desperate seller, don't you? You want someone who wants out of it. They've made a bad decision, whatever reason, they just want some money out of this thing to get away from it. So this buyer has what he wants here, a desperate seller. So he probably bought all of this at a very discounted rate. And now he has ownership of it, but he can't take possession until after the father is dead. But the young man now has this money that he was after. So he gathered it all together, he turned it into cash, and he went on a journey into a distant country. And there he squandered his estate, living recklessly. Have we seen anyone do that? Can we identify with that? Now, again, we got to remember a parable is what? It's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. It's a story told about things that happen here on earth, but it has a spiritual application. So, we see people, I think, every day. I think we are all guilty every day of squandering our lives on what we want. We chase after worldly things and squander our spiritual inheritance. Do we not? I do. Well, that's what's going on here. The young man just goes through it. And then, now when he had spent everything, that was his choice. I mean, he was the one that decided to do it and go through it. When he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred. That was not his choice. That was something that happened that was out of his control. That's life. There are going to be times in our lives where things that we did not expect to happen. So while we're out here squandering our life, thinking that we've got all this time to do what we need to do later on, sometimes it don't work out that way. Sometimes things happen where we don't get that opportunity. And that's what happened to this young man. He has already squandered his time, his money, and now all of a sudden life hits. A famine happens. And we don't even have a concept of what famine is in this country. Let's just share a little bit about what happens in a famine. In a famine, you can read through history. In famines, true famines, you have people eating people. You have mothers eating their children. You have, I mean, it's horrible. In the 1800s, there was a famine, and I forget the place that it was happening. I'm thinking it was England, but I'm not for sure. The pastor that I was listening to shared the story. So some of the details slipped my mind. But in this famine, there were so many people dying, they didn't know what to do with all the bodies. And so they would actually, the city had to make this ordinance that if someone died in front of your house, you were the one responsible for getting rid of the body. You had to take it and throw it in the river. There would actually be fights in the streets because people would go out early and drag the body to someone else's house so they wouldn't have to get rid of it. People were eating people. There was one story where this one family went into their home, bricked in a room, completely bricked themselves in to protect their bodies from being eaten after they died. This famine is a horrible thing. Now, this famine is what's happening to this young man. And where does he find himself at? It says it occurred in that country. What country? The country that he had ran to. He had left home. That's something else that was very offensive to these scribes and Pharisees. Not only did this young man disrespect and dishonor his father, he even left the Jews. He went into a far country. He left Israel and went to the Gentiles. I mean, this young man has dishonored himself and become the most heinous of sinners that anyone can imagine in this culture, in this society. Jesus is painting the picture of the worst of the worst. Okay, this is the guy who lives on Skid Row. This is the guy who has made a complete waste of his life, has completely rebelled against society, rebelled against all norms. This is the guy that nobody wants to have any part to do with. That's the story, that's the picture that Jesus is trying to paint here to these scribes and Pharisees. So he finds himself impoverished. He's done lost it all. And so he went and hired himself. That word hired is the Greek word kalao. It means to glue. So he goes and he glues himself. He attaches himself to this person in this foreign country. And the guy sent him into the fields to feed swine. The most despicable animal that a Jew can think of. Now this guy is out here eating with the swine. The next verse, I think, says, and he was desiring to be fed with the pods. Those pods were corrosion. It was a bark off of a tree. It was the poorest of the poorest people's food, but it was high in protein and it was used to fatten hogs. Very distasteful, but it sustained life and would give you good sustenance. But he was eating the pods that the swine were fed, and no one was giving him anything. So this young man now finds himself at the bottom. I mean, he's hit rock bottom. We've all heard that analogy. He has hit rock bottom. He is in the worst place that anyone can imagine. But when he came to himself, that is where we all need to get to. When he came to himself. When he began to take stock of his situation, when he became to be aware of the choices he had made and where they had led him to. There has to be a time in a person's life when they take stock of who they are spiritually. There has to be a time where we realize how bad off we are, how truly desperate we are. That's what's happening to this young man. He's taking stock. And he said, how many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I am dying here with hunger? His thoughts go to his father. His thoughts have been trying to stay away from this father he despised. He didn't want to think about this father. He didn't want to have anything to do with this father. But then when he becomes desperate, when he realizes that he's helpless, who is the one person that he can think of to turn to for help? The Father. He thinks about his Father. So he takes stock and he realizes his only source of help. I will rise and go to my father and will say to him. Now, this is another thing that really, until you understand the culture, can be easily glanced over. When this young man done what he did to his father and dishonored his family and his father's name so badly, this is more than likely what happened. This is the common thing that would happen in this culture. the father had a funeral. There was a funeral service given for this young man, because to the father, this young man was dead. He was no longer the son. He was dead to him. He was out of the family. He might as well be buried. So this young man, thinking about going back to this father, he's going back as a dead man. He's going back as someone who has no rights, no claim, nothing to offer. He's dead. He's cut off. I will rise and go to my father and will say to him. Not only would that, but also everyone in the town knows the story of what happened. Again, the father had a funeral service. People come to the funeral service. Mourners come to the funeral service. There was a lot of sympathy being given to the father by those around him of this son who became so dishonorable. So this young man is now faced with the only choice of going back to his father, but going back to the town who is going to scorn him. They're going to make fun of him. They're going to ridicule him. They're going to have nothing to do with him. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men. I think this is my opinion. The preacher I heard preaching didn't say anything about it. This is my opinion. I think the young man probably went back hoping nobody recognized him. He's going to go back to this town and try to fit in with the hired men. Now, these hired men, again, this is one social status above a beggar. So back then you had the property owners in the family. And then you had servants or slaves. Now they were part of the family. They lived on the property. They were taken care of by the owner of the property. They had all their needs met. They had their own living space. They raised their own families there. They lived on this property. They were taken care of by the father, and they were decently well off. And then you had below that the day workers, the hired men. These men had no one watching out for them. They had nothing of any value. They lived literally from day to day, hand to mouth. There was the law back then, if you hired a day worker, you had to pay them their wages at the end of that day, because that was what their family was depending on to eat supper that night. You remember the story when the father sent out seekers to hire people. They went out in the morning, they went out in the afternoon, they went out in the evening, and at the end of the day, everybody got the same wages. Remember that story? So these are the kind of people we're talking about. They are at the very lowest of the society level. And I think that this young man was hoping he could just kind of fit in here with these hired men and get an opportunity to go work for his father. Why? Because he knew his father was generous. He had seen his father, how his father treated hired men in the past. And he just wanted to be one of them. It says, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men. This is another thing that is fitting to the culture, is this: if a young man was to come back and try to come back into the family, he would have to make restitution. Number one, if he showed up at the gate to his father's house, his father wouldn't even receive him. His father wouldn't even allow him to come in. There's going to have to be some restitution made. There's going to have to be some begging and some groveling made. There's going to have to be some kind of demonstration of your true sorrow. Reminds me of religion. Reminds me of, I'm not good enough to go to church. I'm going to get my life straightened out first, and then I'll go to church. I got this in my life, and I can't see God I got to get rid of that. There's a song I can think of, Lord, don't let me die with whiskey on my breath. I don't want to go to heaven with whiskey on my breath. There's that thought that I have to clean my life up a little bit first before I can approach God. Well, that's the same. I mean, this thought is not new. This is a thought that the scribes and Pharisees had. This was the law of the land. If you done what this young man done and you sought to be restored into your family, you had to do some penance. You had to make some payment. You had to pay for what you done, and then by the grace of the Father, he might let you start coming back into the family. And so this is what the young man is expecting to do. He's going to try to somehow or another work hard enough so that he can buy back what he sold early on. He's going to try to restore and bring back to the table what he had already went through. So his only plan is, if I can get that back, then maybe my Father will accept me back in. That's basically what his plan is. So he rose up and he came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion. He felt hurt in his stomach. He saw him and his stomach was in knots. There's a whole lot of reasons for this. He knew what his son was getting ready to go through. First of all, let's notice that he was looking for him. He saw him while he was still a long way off. No one announced that his son was coming. He was already out there looking for his son, hoping the son would come back home. He loved his son. He missed his son. He's grieved his son since the day of his funeral. But he's never gave up hope. He's still looking for his son. Even though he allowed his son to go down the road he wanted to go down and sin as much as he wanted to sin and spend all that he had and waste it. Even though he allowed him to do that, he never stopped loving it. Even though his son had dishonored and disrespected him, the worst that any son could ever do, he still loved his son, still grieved for his son, and was still looking for his son. And while he was yet a way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran. Now here's another thing about the culture that really means so much. Eastern Middle men don't run. It was a shame, a total embarrassment for a man to allow his legs to be seen in public. There was one rule where if a man, you could never rate the robes they wore, especially the men of any kind of political or wealth stature or whatever, respected men, they wore robes that had to touch the ground. And there was this one analogy that was written in the rules as an example. For example, if a man were to be walking and a bird was to run underneath his robe, he could not get it out. Because in order to get out, he would raise his robe and thereby allow maybe an ankle to be seen. And so they suggested that he simply walk over and sit down until evening when it got dark, and then he could raise his robe and get the bird out. Now that seems crazy to us, but this was serious to them. This was their culture. This, to have displayed your leg in public, would be a total dishonoring of yourself. People would mock you for that. Now, this young man is coming back to this town, and is going to be met with scorn. It's going to be made fun of, ridiculed, possibly beaten by all the people around. They had no use for this young man. But the father had compassion. He didn't care to have shame. He bore the shame for his son. He jerked them skirts up, and he took off running right through the middle of town, showing everybody's legs, and runs right to his son, and wraps his arms around him, and kisses him. He didn't want his son to bear the shame of coming back to the town in the position that he was. So he bore the shame. Remember the verse we read in Hebrews? Counting it joy, he went to the cross, despising the shame, but he took it for us. Wow. He ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. This against heaven, it means as high as heaven. My sins are so many that they piled up there as high as the heavens. I've sinned so much. And I've sinned all this before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. These are the same words that he had said he was going to say. Remember, back up in verse number 19, it says, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men. But that's not shown here. He leaves off the part, make me as one of your hired men. Why? There's no reason for it anymore. He's just been restored. His father has just received him. His father's just hugged him and kissed him. Didn't matter how dirty he was, how filthy he was. Didn't matter what he had done. The father had just received him. But the father said to his slaves, quickly, bring out the best robe. This robe was a robe that was reserved for the most honored person in the home. This was the father's robe. This was a robe that would be given for a very respected guest to wear while they were there. This is the robe of honor. Bring that robe out here and put it on my son. And put a ring on his hand, a ring of the family emblem, the ring that allows him to conduct business in the name of the Father. The ring that everyone sees that ring, they respect the person wearing that ring because of who the Father is. Put that ring on him. And sandals on his feet, and bring the fattened calf, the calf that's always held back and reserved for the most wonderful of occasions. The calf that's always kept up and being prepared for this nice, huge ceremony where you're going to invite all these people. Bring out that fattened calf, kill it. Let's celebrate. I tell you, in the same way, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents. In the same way, I tell you, there's joy in the presence of angels of God over one sinner who repents. They're going to have a celebration. The Father is joyful for the return of this Son. For this son of mine who was dead, remember they had a funeral, has come to life again. He was lost and has been found. And they began to celebrate. Man, can you identify with the prodigal son? I hope you can. I want to finish reading this story. Now his older son was in the field. And when he came and approached the house, he heard the music and dancing. And summoning one of the servants, he began inquiring what these things could be. Now remember, his father is spending his inheritance at this point. This is all his now, because the younger son, the prodigal son's already wasted all his. So he's coming back, and his father's throwing this big party with his stuff. And he's like, what's going on here? And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed your fatted calf because he has received him back safe and sound. But he became angry. Can you imagine that? But he became angry and was not wanting to go in. And his father came out and began pleading with him. But he answered and said to his father, look, for so many years I have been serving you, and never have I neglected a command of yours, and yet never have you given me a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. Remember who he's talking to? The scribes and the Pharisees. Who do you think he's describing right here? We've kept the law. We've even put fences around the law and live outside them fences to keep us from breaking your law. We're a holy people. We don't associate with sinners. We're the good son. We're the 99 who stayed in the flock. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your wealth with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him? And he said to him, child, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, for this brother of yours was dead and is alive, and was lost and has been found. Now Jesus ends the story there. But we know the ending of the story, don't we? You see, this young man becomes very angry. And in an attempt to bring honor back to the home, he kills the father. That happened when the crowd cried, crucify him. If you remember the story, Jesus was on trial. Pilate was going to release Jesus. And the scribes and the Pharisees went among the people and said, tell them to release Barabbas and crucify Jesus. The people who had all this political clout, who couldn't stand Jesus, who didn't like what he was trying to accomplish in their town. This is who he's talking to. They're the good son. They're the son that stayed home. They're the righteous one. They're the one who obeyed all the rules and chafed underneath the Father all their lives so that they could at one point gain what they would inherit. They also had no relationship with the Father. If they'd had a relationship with the Father, they would have shared in his joy. They would have been happy that their father was happy when the son came back home. They would have trusted their father that he would have done what was right. If they'd had a relationship with the Father, they would have known him. They would have known what he would do. So this second son also has no relationship with the Father. Now think about what was going to happen after this. Can you imagine the relationship that the prodigal son now has with the Father? The one who was dead has been restored. The love the respect, the cherishment that that young man would have had for his father? Can you see how his life was going to be changed forever? And how he would seek to bring honor to his father out of love for him, not out of duty, not because it was expected, but because he loved his father. He would do all he could to bring honor to his father's name. I tell you, I want to be the prodigal son. I want to be the one who comes back and finds love with the Father. I don't want to be the self-righteous son who thinks he's got it all and he's going to lose everything and brings more reproach to the name of God than any of them. Does the story mean more to you now than it did? It does to me. I mean, it's a very simple story that a child can understand. But when you really understand what Jesus was saying, he painted the picture of the most heinous sinner one could imagine, the worst of the worst, and showed these scribes and Pharisees that this is the one that God is seeking. This is the one that Jesus died for. This is the one who can come to the Father, not the one that's obeying all the rules, not the one who's religious, not the one who's doing everything right and is self-righteous in their own way, who thinks that they're better than this brother over here. You see the difference in the two sons. Which son do you want to be? We gave the invitation at the beginning. And I asked you then to just examine your relationship with the Father. And I'm going to ask you again as we begin our worship this morning to reflect on that. And reflect on what the Father done for you. The Father in the story, by the way, is Jesus, not God. Jesus was the one who bore the shame. Jesus is the one that was crucified. Jesus was the one who was dishonored by the good son. Jesus is the one who's rejected by people today, by the way. This story means so much more to me now, and I'm so thankful for hearing that message. I hope it's blessed your heart this morning. Let's worship.